Well, welcome everyone. I'm Professor Vicky Clifton and I'm the chair for today's webinar on conflict resolution. And I'm also the chair of the Workforce Development Subcommittee for WHRTN. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today. And I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'm coming to you today from Quandamooka land in the Redlands. So today we're going to discuss conflict resolution, and it is a very complex area and often an area that we don't have a lot of expertise in handling with. In fact, it's often something that we struggle with on a daily basis. We have a great panel of experts from the MARTA in Brisbane with us today to share their knowledge on this subject. We have Mr. Nick Hollowbone, who is Senior Manager of Employee Relations, Health, Safety and Wellbeing. Welcome, Nick. And Nick's going to give an overview of handling difficult situations from a policy and legislative perspective. We also have Miss Jo Griffin, who is Head of Corporate Learning in MARTA Education. And Jo will provide us with tips to handle those tough conversations using the principles of speaking with good judgment. On our panel, we have Professor Alison Pettit, who is Executive Director of Research at MARTA Research. We have Associate Professor Kim Ray, who is a Senior Group Leader at MARTA Research. And we have Associate Professor Samira Hasnain, who is Chair of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee at MARTA and a mid-career researcher. We also have Linda Skinner and Amy Armstrong here with us from the WHRTN team. So we've shared 4 scenarios with you that we will speak to today. And some of these scenarios may be triggering, so please don't hesitate to reach out to your employee assistance program and speak to a counsellor or Lifeline if you need to work through today's discussions. I've got a little bit of housekeeping before we commence. Please don't write in the chat or Q&A until the seminar is completed, as apparently it interferes with the webinar recording. We can't cover everything today, so if you feel that you'd like a deeper dive into any aspect of what we discussed today, please let us know when you receive the survey on the webinar. And please make sure that you answer the survey and tell us what you thought was beneficial in what's been presented today to you. So the webinar is being recorded, and if you miss any of it, you can access it via a link that will be shared in the chat or on the WHRTN website. And so now I will hand over to Nick, and Nick's going to start to talk today about scenarios 1 and 2. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Vicky. Good afternoon, everybody. As Vicky said, I'm going to work through 2 specific scenarios, both very different in terms of context and facts, from a more legislative and employee relations perspective, and then we will hand to a panel for a more real life perspective in terms of those. In terms of scenario 1, which we have up on the screen, I will just read through in case anybody's joining from a mobile and doesn't have access, but a PhD supervisor has asked a PhD student on a date. Student politely declines and states she's in a relationship. At a work-related dinner, the PhD supervisor tells the student's partner that he wants to sleep with her. Partner laughs it off, but later the student is upset by the comments. Further forward, at a conference, the same PhD supervisor books accommodation for the whole team to stay together, including this person and the supervisor over the course of the conference. During the course of this trip, the supervisor comes into the student's room and makes the student feel uncomfortable by making some personal suggestive comments. And the question posed is how should this be handled? And I need to just call out at the outset that the behaviour exhibited throughout the course of this scenario is quite serious and would meet the legal definition of sexual harassment, which then brings on itself a range of complicated intricacies in terms of managing it in the moment, but also managing these scenarios after the fact. I will just call out that there's been some significant legislative reform through the Respect at Work legislative reform that has now placed a positive obligation on all employers and officers within employment to actively promote and stamp out sexual harassment. And from there has been a large body of work that's pushing further forward to better educate everybody in terms of what their rights and also what their responsibilities are in and outside of the workplace in terms of eradicating sexual harassment. If you would like some further information on that legislative reform and what those new obligations and new information brackets are, I'd encourage you to look at respectatwork.gov.au. There's a plethora of information there in terms of the legislative reform itself, but in terms of some fact sheets and a wide range of links in terms of where to get internal and external report. In terms of this scenario and how this should be handled from the perspective of the PhD student themselves, it's imperative that the first thing to do when finding somebody or yourself in this situation is to immediately remove themselves from that situation and seek help or support or guidance from anybody relevant at that time. And that does include, if you're feeling unsafe, is to notify the authorities and call the police and find a safe place to remove yourself from that situation. That would be something that would be prevalent in this situation in terms of the escalating behaviour of the PhD supervisor into entering that student's room on a work trip. As part of further managing this, it would be advisable to continue to or start to keep a record of this behaviour. This scenario is an example of some escalating and compounding behaviour throughout an extended course of time, and it would be imperative that a record or is start to have kept by the PhD student in terms of also managing or removing themselves from this situation. It would be best for them to seek professional help through counselling service or EAP or helpline upon immediately removing themselves from this situation. And then it really becomes a point of asking or seeking that advice in terms of your workplace rights. And there's a range of information to seek that, whether that's internally through your local human resource functions or your employee relations functions, or externally through human rights commissions, police link, or through the Respect at Work page and resources there, which I will put in the chat further to the finalisation of this afternoon. In terms of some people internally who the PhD student could seek support from, it could be another senior person within the organisation, it could be a trusted colleague, or in circumstances like this, my recommendation would be that they immediately report it to the relevant human resources department to seek immediate remedial action internally in terms of removing the PhD supervisor and student relationship while further inquiries are undertaken. In terms of any further or in some scenarios, students will not feel comfortable in terms of raising these concerns internally. There are mechanisms now through the Human Rights Commission of Australia, but also localised human rights commissions, depending which state you're in, that allow confidential lines of support in terms of people seeking guidance and advice and support through raising these experiences and concerns. And there's also been a legislative introduction recently where people are able to apply to the Fair Work Commission, which is a Australia-wide jurisdiction for a Stop Sexual Harassment order. That is a situation where an external body such as the Fair Work Commission will actively intervene in a situation and impose an order on the individual and, in some circumstances, an employer to stop or make amendments to reporting lines or actions that will immediately look after the safety and the well-being of the person who has raised those concerns. In terms of some people or instances where somebody has raised these nature of these concerns with you, or in an example where a PhD or the PhD student in this scenario seeks that further support from yourself in your position, my advice to you in that instance is to stop and ensure that the PhD student is in a safe environment, and to listen to them without judgment or interruption. Allow them to articulate their own version of events without any interruption or judgment, and to actively listen to what they're saying, and allow them to tell their story completely. Seek to minimise any immediate harm and ensure privacy. That may be removing both yourself and the student from the particular site, or being out of sight. And then further recognising that this behaviour can cause distress, and provide them with the support to obtain the appropriate support, or provide them the contact details of the appropriate human resource person internally, or alternatively work with them to obtain external supports through the commissions I've just mentioned previously, or immediately moving forward to support through the Fair Work Commission. In terms of conflict resolution in a sexual harassment or vein, it's important that in some instances recognising that local conflict resolution is no longer suitable, and that it needs to be escalated, and people need to be removed and taken out of the situation. And it's important to understand that in some instances you may in yourself feel comfortable calling out this behaviour in the first instance, and it's always a recommended approach to call out behaviour at the time as early as possible in the first instance. But in terms of circumstances such as scenario one, it's also important to recognise that a person's safety and well-being are paramount, and that in some instances people need to remove themselves immediately from these situations, seek safety, seek support, and seek to understand their options. And then that's when internal and external bodies such as either human resource functions or external bodies like the Human Rights Commission or the Fair Work Commission have legislatively guided processes which are embedded to allow support for somebody in the situation such as the PhD student in scenario one. Linda, we might pop to the next slide to scenario two, which is quite a stark difference in terms of factual circumstances, but another example of conflict in the workplace in on itself. And again, just for the benefit of anybody that's on a phone and not in front of a screen, the scenario two relates to a project manager who works 3 days a week, but their manager is consistently contacting them through a variety of methods: phone, text, emails, after hours, or on their days off, following things up on workload, asking questions, asking them to action things immediately. And this consistent contact outside of work is starting to cause a growing stress and anxious tendencies on the project manager. The project manager's raised issues with the manager, who agrees to no longer overstep outside of work, but this continues to happen. And how should this be handled by the project manager? In terms of initial steps to manage this, my advice to the project manager would be to immediately detail in writing and relay back to their supervisor what was discussed and agreed, and to be very specific and detailed in terms of using those examples of the texts and phone calls after hours, checking the engagement documents or your employee contract and referring back to that in terms of, is there a clause around after hours of availability? Is there a clause around further reasonable tasks at the discretion of your supervisor, and start to detail in writing what is agreed reasonable after hours contact, or is there no after hours contact, and begin to create a written time frame and documentation of of these examples, and also the conversations and the agreement that you've made with your supervisor. It's also important to, again, relay how this behaviour is having an impact on you as a person and your well-being, and continue to start keeping a record should this behaviour continue. If it continues, again, my advice would be to start to seek support laterally from another team member, or somebody more senior in the organisation who you have a trusted relationship, but continue to follow up in writing with the supervisor, highlighting that they're not following what's been agreed between you both. They're highlighting that it's not in line with your contractual arrangements or what's agreed from a work description perspective. And then if it continues, it needs to be escalated, or my advice would be to escalate it through your formal channels in terms of your grievance processes locally through your human resources processes there. Yeah, but I must stress, if at any point it's becoming too much of an impact on a person's health and well-being, that they need to make those decisions that relate to their health and well-being first and remove themselves from that scenario. And again, stressing that keeping a record and detailing what's been agreed back in writing will allow you to effectively manage locally, but also escalate when what's been agreed between the project manager and the senior is not met. Thanks, Vicky.
Thank you, Nick. That was great. So now I'm going to hand over to our panel, and I'd like to start with Ali first. Ali, in terms of scenario one, from your perspective in your leadership role, how would that be managed?
And Nick provided some really great advice with respect to this scenario, which is actually a very serious scenario, and absolutely there are many protections in place for the student who was very much suffering from a significant power imbalance. And my advice is that it's very often it's better to be really proactive about actually taking action on things that are an emerging problem in advance before they become actually a really big issue. So really most universities would have policies that it's not appropriate for a student and one of their supervisors to have a relationship, because that's a serious conflict of interest. And so when the first approach was made with respect to the request for the date, even though the refusal to that was accepted at the time and there was no repercussions of that, it would have been reasonable for the student at that time to perhaps reach out to their milestone committee, reach out to the student support team, and just flag that there's a potential concern or potential risk scenario here as a consequence of the supervisor indicating that they have that they're potentially attracted to the student, so that there are people aware of this being a risk and who are actively keeping an eye on the situation on behalf of the student. So there's definitely things that can be done in the background for leadership to monitor these situations. There's also often policies in place around travel arrangements that can protect students from or other staff members from ending up in a vulnerable situation through decisions like shared accommodation. And so make sure you know those sorts of policies well and use them to your advantage. We would not expect we have policies in place that every single individual really has to arrange their own travel, so they're in control of what their accommodations are in those scenarios. And if it was requested for shared accommodation, we would look at that very specifically, because we'd want to know why that's the case and ensure that all risks are mitigated in that scenario. So I think the advice would be that you can raise concerns or potential risks without actually making an accusation. So you can have these conversations with more senior people who can assist you without triggering a really big scenario. So acting early could have potentially prevented the more serious scenarios happening.
Yeah, definitely. Samira, from your perspective, and I'm probably thinking from the EDI perspective, but also from the initiatives that currently are running at MARTA, if you had a student or someone you were mentoring come to you in relation to what was occurring, what would your advice be for handling it?
Well, it's definitely clear that because there have been multiple advances by the PhD supervisor, it's clear that a direct conversation and probably a resolution straight away with the PhD supervisor is not going to work. So, and it's highly unlikely to be fruitful. So one thing I would say is that documenting all the supervisors' behaviors, especially writing down the inappropriate comments and advances that have been made, is a really good idea, because it can be helpful if the student decides to take it to a formal complaint. And my advice would be to remember to do that. Approach a mentor or a trusted advisor, just like Ali said on their panel, or even a peer, a postdoc in the lab that they are comfortable with approaching to discuss what's happened, and then obviously go to the universities or the institute's human resources department, which can provide further support and guidance along these lines.
Yeah, thanks, Samira. Kim, I wanted to ask you, from the perspective of your position as a research leader, what sorts of advice would you provide to a student in scenario one?
I think, like everybody said, the sooner that something is put in place to limit the risk for the student, the better, because we all know that people in situations of stress or people who are in positions of power can speak out inappropriately, and the potential damage to that student's long-term reputation is also a strategic thing that we need to think about long-term for that student. And it does put her in a situation of vulnerability. So I think the sooner she actually, like everyone says, has it documented, she's reported that supervisor to the graduate school, put all of those things in to protect herself, the better, because the behaviour is absolutely inappropriate, but you don't want to have career-changing outcomes because of that reputational damage that could potentially happen as well.
Thank you. Ali?
Just as a follow-up question, I just wanted to say that we have managed many times changes in supervisory positions, which can be stressful at the time, but in the long term, the student has still been really successful. So while it might seem like a massive challenge and potential barrier at the time, we can actually be quite creative about finding alternative ways to ensure that the student's PhD continues without a lot of with removing the risk of the poorly behaving supervisor from that scenario. So don't think that you've got no option and that you're stuck because you're in this PhD.
Yep. Nick, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Vicky. I was just going to add to Alison's point there. A lot of the new legislative reform really focuses on the ability to allow people to raise these issues in a safe and private manner, and ensure that there isn't any unwanted recourse or detriment, and that is the big focus for the legislative reform and for the new positive obligations on employers is to manage these really appropriately and really privately, and ensure that people can feel safe coming forward and raising these concerns at the earliest juncture, and feel like it's not going to have any detrimental impact to whatever project they're on now or more broadly. And it's absolutely important and imperative that people are allowed to raise these concerns, even at a local level, in the safest environment. So I just wanted to add that point in as well.
Thanks, Nick. Kim?
Yeah, sorry. The other thing I did want to raise is that certainly at MARTA and at University of Queensland, and I'm sure other institutions have this as well, we have a network of first responders who are people that are within our workforce that people can reach out to, particularly for people if you're only a fairly new student, you may not have a mentor in place, you may not know your peers very well. Those first responders are actually trained in making sure that you're safe and putting those things in place around you.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. And thanks, Samira. I knew that you were going to also mention that. In the interest of time, we won't discuss scenario 2, but if you do have any questions in relation to scenario 2, please put them in the chat or the Q&A at the end. Our next speaker is Jo Griffin, and Jo's going to talk about scenario 3 and 4 and give us some of an overview of speaking with good judgment. So thank you, Jo.
Thanks, Vicky, and thanks, Nick, and the panel for your thoughts on the previous scenarios. Some of the tips and the skills that I'm about to introduce you to for scenario 3 and 4 can actually be used also for the scenarios that that Nick raised as well. So just know that they can all be connected in. So I'll read out scenario 3 in case there's some people who aren't near the PDF document that was sent around. So a team works within a very competitive environment where the team leader plays one team member off by electing favourites and rewarding them generously, while other team members are bullied to meeting work deadlines. The disgruntled team turn on each other by backstabbing, gossiping, ostracising the quieter team members, and occasionally sabotaging others' experimental work. One team member of the team can't tolerate this situation, but has a 2-year contract and has a great and productive project that will result in grants and publications when it's completed. And without these outcomes, there'll be no other job prospects on the horizon. She realises she's stuck there for now, but she also recognises that the behaviour is unacceptable. And so what should she do? So we'll move on to the next slide. Thank you. At the heart of what's going on here is a lack of psychological safety within that particular professional team. Psychological safety in the workplace has become much more increasingly prevalent, not only from a concept of research and practice, but also through legislation across most states and territories in in Australia now have their own particular legislation that compels employers to create a psychologically safe place for their employees to work, including within that research space. Key, if you're interested in exploring a bit more about the concept about psychological safety in the workplace, Professor Amy Edmondson is from the Harvard Business School in the US, and she's quite prolific in her writing. Timothy Clark, who's somebody, I love his podcasts and his TED Talks on this area. So he's also from the US. And in Australia, our most prominent person who talks about this in particular with relating to healthcare teams, and also by having that psychological safe workplace, the impact upon both the employee group, but also upon patient care. And what are some of that research is Professor Jeffrey Braithwaite. So that's our local Australian sort of subject matter expert. If I gave you a definition here of psychological safety, I'll take it from probably the most well-known of the 3 there, Professor Edmondson, who states that it's a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, and that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. And on the right-hand side is actually Timothy Clark's model of having that inclusion, that learner safety, that contributor safety, and challenger safety, that in fact, having a little bit of conflict in teams is actually not a bad thing, because it actually increases innovation, that we can actually think outside the square and start challenging ideas or assumptions that may be made, and sort of getting to that point. It's where it goes to that point of psychological safety is not present. It can go to the point of apathy or to the point of aggression. And that's sort of the balance that we need to have when it comes to sort of having those conversations within the workplace and creating that safe space for our employees to work. Next slide, please. So what's going on in this scenario? The first thing, if I'm going to just go towards the person who is experiencing this early career researcher she feels as if she's sort of been isolated and she doesn't know what to say. She's more than likely in her survival brain, and that part of the brain that is that flight, fight, fear, freeze, and that really sort of instinctive emotional part. And so there comes a point where you can either make that choice to sort of say, okay, do I need to have a conversation with this colleague, or do I need to sort of walk away? My one sort of guiding tip for you is, if you're in that red zone of your brain, do not have that conversation there and then. You're better off to take some time away, get some self-reflection, and then come back to that when you're in that more prefrontal cortex part of your brain, which is that more rational thinking part of your brain, because our emotions are contagious. And when we have that emotional contagion, especially if in your red zone, which could be a little bit below the line, the other person who you're about to have that conversation with is likely to join you below the line, and it could be a really unproductive and really quite discouraging conversation. Next slide, please. When we are not in that, when we focus on staying in that red zone, when we can't quite get out of that in that moment, when we really want to say something and speak up, and we've got those doubts and you might be angry or you're scared, or the things that come up is these types of elements. So it's not good in the workplace. It's that when we have that limbic response, we've got heightened cortisol and adrenaline going in our bodies. It can increase the stress levels. And when that occurs, of course, we can have all of these outcomes to do with performance and our work experience, our experiences of work, which is the last thing you want in the workplace when you're actually trying to do your study and get to your outcomes for your research. So the next click, please. So what's happening here is that the contagious, and that's what happened in the previous section, it was that there was this connection with others also joining in on that conversation, and it's quite that contagious when somebody starts below the line with those conversations that others might join in as well. Where our brains are thinking brains, are also social connection brains, so we tend to, by human nature, tend to, in the workplace, if it's not psychologically safe, to be drawn below the line as well. Next slide, thanks. If we have that really positive toward the brain focus, these are the characteristics we're going to see in ourselves when we're at work. So the key ones are, we're much more optimistic, we communicate better, we're actually good at problem solving, creative, we see the bigger picture, and we have that increased resilience. The hormones that are jumping around at the moment in this point of time are serotonin and dopamine. So next couple of 2 clicks, that'd be great. So that serotonin hit gives us that. And interestingly, there's some lots of good studies on serotonin that I've been reading about recently, saying how it's actually, when it breaks down into different component parts, is actually almost like it mitigates that impact of cortisol in particular. So having a serotonin hit in those moments, that joy, that happiness can actually bring, sort of mitigate the impact of stress. Serotonin's produced mainly in the gut. So of course, when you eat chocolate, guess what's coming out? Serotonin. So I'm recommending that too for everyone. But again, like before I mentioned about the below the line type as sort of negative activity, it's also the fact that when we're having that forward thinking being in our prefrontal cortex, that rational thinking part of our brain, when we're with others, that's contagious as well. That positive sort of upward thinking, that forward focusing, that can actually support us in those moments as well. Next slide. I think what might be happening for the early career researcher, I can unpack very quickly relating to Marta's mind mastery tool. Now, this comes from this is our tool that we've developed at Marta to unpack what those triggers and rewards or threats and trigger states might be. It's based on the work from somebody called Dr. David Rock from the Neuro Leadership Institute. He calls his model SCARF, S-C-A-R-F-E. If you want to unpack, look into that more. I'm using how we've adapted it, particularly for a healthcare context. So straight away, I'm thinking that that early career researcher is feeling a threat state relating to membership. Does she belong to feeling that she's belonging to the group? And that sense of autonomy that she's really struggling to, she knows what's happening, but she's got these outcomes that she needs to meet, and she feels like she doesn't have that sense of control or surety about, you know, if I say something, will that impact my future career here? The talent, she's confident in her talents and skills, but sort of starting to doubt, do they actually think that by what the comments are here? Is there a sense of fairness that's been done here? The rank, I mean, that's such a huge one in this situation, isn't it? That sense of hierarchy. But ultimately, it's that connection to, are my actions and what I'm saying, am I doing connecting with my own personal purpose? And is there a mismatch there? And if there's a mismatch, I'm likely to be in that sense of threat state. So that you can unpack and label it. We call it that naming it to tame it. Once you can start taming that or labeling that emotion of what's going on, it can help you to move from that red zone of your limbic amygdala section to your prefrontal cortex, just by literally putting a label on that emotion that you're feeling. Next point, please. So the takeaway reflections from this particular scenario is that having that sense of emotion is normal within the workplace, but it's not that sense of being able to emotionally regulate your own threat state and what you might be feeling in your red zone, to have a more curious, respectful and helpful conversation if you want to voice your concerns and speak up to this supervisor who's making you feel uncomfortable and not psychologically safe within the workplace. Okay, scenario 2. Scenario 4, I apologize. So weekly lab meetings for a research centre. All research leaders and students are in attendance, and the meeting is chaired by the centre director. As a female research leader presenting work, a colleague raises his hand to ask a question, which is usually acceptable practice in these meetings. But the question is actually delivered in a sarcastic comment on the integrity of the work and the integrity also of the researcher, and everyone laughs, including the centre director. And this occurs again the following week, so a repetitive behaviour. As the female researcher leader discusses some work they are doing, again, everyone laughs and they feel the female researcher leader is really upset, offended, embarrassed. So how should this be handled? Next slide, thank you. What I can see here is that and these tools that I've introduced in both the scenarios can actually be used for either. So they actually connect really nicely with both. But you heard me talk about in the first one, a below the line and above the line conversation. So this is definitely a below the line approach to communicating with your team members. To me, again, it sounds like there's a lack of psychological safety when one person starts with a negative comment or a little bit adversarial or a bit of blame or a bit of drama. What happens is others have joined in. So it's often past focus, and it might be a bit interesting because people think, oh, that's really interesting, but a bit gossipy, but it's not useful within the workplace. It doesn't tend to create that psychological safety. In fact, those mirror neurons kick on and it drags people into that vortex, and it's harder to actually get out of it. It needs to have somebody who's got that emotional intelligence to say, you know what? I hear what you're saying, but I'm going forward focus here. I want to know your why. Why are you giving me this feedback? I want to find out because I want to get better at being better, because it's not about who is right. It's about what's right. So let's have a conversation. Let's be forward thinking. Let's look at the detail. Let's be a bit more creative and let's have a look at the why this is occurring. And I would value that from you as my colleague. Next slide. A key factor to hold for both yourself and also for your colleagues in your teams is one that we call the basic assumption. And what the basic assumption asserts is that people, your colleagues that you're working with, are intelligent, they're capable, they care about doing their best, and they want to improve. And when you have to have a conversation where you have a proactive voice to speak up or to share your concerns about what somebody said, you gift them that in that moment because you want to be curious, respectful, and helpful. You can't control what they've said to you, but you can control your own emotional response. And the phrase that I like to think about when I talk about the basic assumption is that nobody comes to work to make a mistake. You know, did that supervisor come to work that day, or those team members come to work that day with the specific intention of wanting to humiliate and embarrass that person, that early career researcher? If they did, that's a different type of conversation. That might be a more formal conversation, but let's get to that curiosity factor and unpack what's actually happening here. So that's that informal conversation to have with someone, and then to maybe escalate it in a different pathway, some of those ones that Nick mentioned before. But one point I want to highlight here is we often don't give the basic assumption to ourselves. We are our own worst critics. So when it comes to feeling so personally attacked, or that they're being challenged and people are questioning your work and what you do, just take a step back and say, you know what, I am intelligent. I am capable, I care about doing my best, and I want to improve. So I'm going to have a conversation with my colleagues and get curious, not furious. Let's get into that point of, can you help me? Can you have my back and help me to get better at being better in my work that I'm doing here in my research? Because I want the same outcomes that you want. I want to have a great career opportunity in this moment. Next slide, please. Something that you can do aligns really nicely with the mind mastery tool is checking in with your emotional pulse. Those moments when you're feeling like you've been hit right here in your triggers and you've gone into that limbic red zone of your thinking. And you can click all the way through to the bottom of the green if you like. So keep going. So in those moments when you feel like you're in that red zone and you think, if I say something now, it's going to be pretty bad because I am so furious or I'm so upset, give yourself time. Take a moment and pause. You need about 10 seconds for that active shift of thinking from your red zone to your green zone in your brain, that amygdala, limbic to that prefrontal cortex. Something simple as taking 3 big deep breaths, and it's breaths that have a different breath pattern to your normal breathing. So it's recommended in the neuroscience literature, actually, that breathing pattern of taking a breath in for 4, holding it for 2, and breathing out for 6, and doing that 3 times is enough to start pushing your thinking from your limbic zone into your prefrontal cortex. You may be sort of sitting in that orange or amber area, but at that time you have made that active shift because your brain is focusing on that altered breathing pattern, not on the emotion that you're feeling. Start labeling it, name it to tame it. What is this? What am I feeling? What's my trigger of feeling? What's that mind mastery sort of label that I can put on this, because it's unique to me in this moment? And if I can start naming it, I can move forward and then go, right, this is what it is. I feel upset because I'm not recognized for my talents. Okay, right. Can I hold the basic assumption now for the other person? Is this person I'm talking with in my team intelligent, capable? Do they care about their best? Do they want to improve? Can I give them that? Okay, if I can, let's get curious. And let's just say, look, I'm actually curious about why you've said that. Can you share? I'd like to hear more from you. Is that okay? But if you're really stuck in that triggered moment, we'll go into that next slide, please. And you're thinking that you might need what we call an out clause. You think, I can't say anything right now because I'm just in this zone and I can't say anything. It's better off. And my background, I'm Irish background. My nana is Irish. I'm a fighter. I'll just go straight in. And I know if I'm in my red zone, I need to move away because I'm likely to come out fighting in that moment. So I need to have that emotional intelligence and emotional regulation of what's going on for me and walk away. Now, some of these standard responses can help you make that exit pathway, but some of them can be used in the moment with curiosity. So I'll get you to place them all up if that's okay. The first one, hey, I'm really curious about this feedback. You know, I'd be open to exploring this in more depth with you and seeing what response you get. Actually, thanks, I see this really differently. So let's talk about it, you know, about your thoughts here. Hey, that feedback is really interesting. So let's discuss it together with our supervisor after the meeting today. Well, I'm really curious if my colleagues here today are holding the basic assumption for me. You know, I am intelligent, capable. I care about my best. I want to improve. So I'd love to receive your feedback. And this one's a little bit longer, but I think you can get the gist of where I'm coming from there. Here is, look, I welcome your feedback, and I'm glad you've got my back in this moment to help me to get better at being better in my work here and in the team. And I'd greatly appreciate it if all my colleagues could be respectful, helpful, and curious in these moments, not only to me, but more importantly for that creation of that sense of trust and psychological safety, but with each other. So I've just introduced you to about 4 or 5 key tools or some skills that you can utilize in those moments to help support your response when those scenarios present themselves. So thank you very much, Vicky. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Jo. It's so informative every time I listen to you talk or get involved in speaking with good judgment. It really makes me think about how I speak and how I react and what I need to do sometimes in terms of being above the line.
And we can all go below the line at work. You know, I'm meant to know this really well, but I have my moments where I go, oh, pick myself up above the line. So we're only human. We're only human.
That's right. So Ali, I'm going to start with you in relation to scenario 3, where you've got that very competitive team. And I wonder whether you want to talk about some of the common issues that arise from that competitive nature.
Yeah, so obviously that's not it's a damaging culture in that particular lab environment. And one of the most common ways that I see this presenting as a manager, where the lab environment is clearly not constructive, is often through authorship disputes. So that's where it's that there's a disagreement in who's really made what contributions and how that should be recognised in the author positioning. And that reflects that the lab is not working collaboratively and is not having proactive continual discussions to ensure that everybody is well informed with where that's at, or appreciating others' contribution and being able to appreciate how they fit into that complex matrix, because it is always really complex. So that's one of the really common ways that this gets presented up to us as executive. These situations can be really quite difficult to resolve, because by the time that escalates, as Jo has said, everyone's in the red zone, and it's really difficult to get them out of that position. And they're too focused on the individual versus the contributions. And so that's what I have to focus on as a manager when I'm trying to resolve this, is to try and remove the emotion from it and get people to focus more on an evidence base about the contributions, the value of those contributions proportionately, and then have constructive conversations around trying to position the whole context of the paper with respect to everybody getting recognition of that role. Like I said, these can take months to resolve, and so that delays people getting their papers out. And if there had been a more proactive action earlier on, when the environment was clearly starting to become destructive or recognised by a new team member as destructive, this could have all perhaps been prevented. And I just want to flag that, you know, with the positive duty that we now have, we as managers, we can only take that positive action if we're aware of a situation. And as we're not embedded in every single team, we can't know what that culture in the team is all the time. And that if people are to raise this with us, we can, through using the really constructive language that Jo's explained, we can often resolve conflicts without it actually becoming a really stressful and hostile situation, because we can use language that is around trying to get people to recognise this is about becoming better and ensuring that everyone can achieve their best at work. So while it can often be difficult to raise these issues, a lot of the time we get really good resolution out of this, and people are even much happier in the workplace, and the team does become a really constructive, positively working team. So you can get to a better place, but you have to have that confidence to first come forward and raise the issue. And there are ways to protect the person who raises the issue as well, so that they're not seen as the target of potentially by the rest of the team as perhaps stirring up a problem.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for that. Kim, I'm going to go on to the scenario 4, the weekly lab meetings. do you have any tips on how to handle that experience?
I think that's a really interesting one. And I think all of us have probably been in the room with someone who has potentially had behaviour like that and have been uncertain on how to respond. And I think it's particularly challenging when it's ongoing systemic behaviour that's being seen in a group. And for me, what I would be doing if I was in that scenario, I think the responses that Joe's given us are just brilliant. Those phrasings to use. If you're the person who's on the spot in the moment, they're brilliant. But if you're someone who doesn't necessarily feel confident to do that, I'd be considering having a chat with one of your formal mentors, or even somebody higher up within your department, and asking if they could do a discreet drop by into one of those meetings to observe the behaviour, so that they can see for themselves what you're talking about, and then consider. I think it would be something that could be escalated to a formal complaint if need be. But I do think it should be worked through with a mentor or a head of school or a head of department, to make sure that doesn't kind of, work in, it become even worse. And my only comment I would say about Joe's scenarios and responses she's given, there is the potential for that to escalate the situation at the time. So I think that's something that whoever chooses to respond at the time has to be very aware that they could potentially be opening themselves up for further escalation of that behaviour in the moment. So that's something to just be aware of as well.
Yeah. Samira, from equity, diversity and inclusion perspective, what are some of the things that we should be thinking about in these scenarios?
Well, I definitely think in the scenario 3, having a clear set of expectations before you go into a lab is really important, so that you know what the environment is like. But if that's not possible, revisiting some of the expectations at a professional development sort of review stage is really important, and having it in writing, I think, to make it really official so that there's no competition within the lab. And this, I think, is a really proactive way of working through the competitive behavior through the lab, and also having some allies that you can actually talk to, because going through this is probably a very difficult situation, and having some confidential chats with someone, and so that they can support you and maybe guide you through this. With scenario 4, the only thing I was going to add is that if ethical bystander training is available within your institute, should make use of that, because that can really help you, derogatory sort of language and harassing behaviors that can be normalized in sort of institutes and academia, and also understand the legal context of these behaviors and recognize when someone needs help, and actually giving you the confidence and maybe skills in safe intervention methods as well, so that you can understand boundaries and reporting pathways as well.
No, thank you, Samira. Joe.
Vicky, I was just going to affirm what Samira said, but also Kim, that this is in the key word in the scenario was that notion that it's being repeated. So it's a repeated behaviour. So it's not just a one-off. So when we start looking at this as a repeated either exclusion or behaviour or some sort of approach, that's really when we start looking at formal conversations in that sense.
Yeah. Ali?
Just 2 quick points. One on a scenario 3, where there is a mention of experiments being sabotaged. That is a really serious offence in research as well. And so really, I would hope there is a positive duty on everyone, if they have witnessed something like that happening, that they would report it. So I'd encourage you to do so. And again, that can be done confidentially in ways managed that protect the person who is reporting that behaviour. And then with respect to scenario 4, I think there's also, that hasn't been discussed, is the disappointing role of the supervisor, the manager in this scenario. And managers have a tough job. They always have opportunity to improve as well. And so there could have been an opportunity here for either the researcher being targeted to actually request a meeting with their manager and flag how they did not feel supported and that they were vulnerable in that situation, and discuss how the manager could have supported them better in that, or go to a colleague who they trust to then go speak to the manager on their behalf to put forward their case. So again, you can do this in a way that is not accusationary, that you're going there to actually promote positive, constructive change in the workplace behaviour that helps meet your needs.
Yep. Thanks, Sally. Now I'm going to open up for questions to our audience. So if anyone has any questions, please put them into the Q&A or the chat, and I'll pass them over for our panel to answer. While we're waiting, we will be distributing some information around speaking with good judgment. Jo, are we?
So there's just some of the tools that we mentioned before that have been emailed. They'll be emailed out. If anyone wants to know a little bit more about externally, we call our Speaking with Good Judgment program High Value Conversations, and the Mater Education website has more information about that online.
Okay, so the first question is, how do you deal with systemic bullying? And I might ask Nick to answer that one to start off with.
Thanks, Vicky. I think in terms of following up a few points that have been made about a few of the scenarios this afternoon, it's very important to raise these concerns with the right people at the earliest opportunity. What that allows is that early intervention, and then from there we can, or an organisation can continue to explore and garner more information to understand and articulate exactly what the concerns are and what are the linkages and the causations of these behaviours. And when you can really start to understand what's causing the behaviour, and why is it repeated? Why is it seen through a range of other people? You can really start to understand the root cause and start to address that root cause rather than just the person or the instance that is presented to us. So I think it's really important to raise these things at the earliest opportunity that you can, that you feel safe to, with the people that you feel are trusted to, and being aware of the policies and procedures and supports both internally and externally. But in terms of sort of addressing that systemic nature, it's really about an organisation understanding the causations and what exactly is contributing and allows that sort of behaviour to manifest and continue to grow in an organisation. It's much more detailed than just addressing that behaviour in its instance. It's really about understanding what goes into that and how to explore that a little bit further.
So if you're a part of that, is that a conversation you have with HR?
Yeah, potentially if you are involved in those sort of circumstances and you don't feel you have, or you've reached out to your local supports or a mentor or another colleague, and those instances haven't rendered the solution that you think is reasonable for yourself, or the behaviour hasn't stopped. It's absolutely that scenario where you reach out to your trusted HR partners and they start to work through your options at that informal channel first, and then escalate where appropriate from a psychosocial safety perspective or anything of the like. But in terms of where you feel that that's systemic and ongoing, and that anything that you've tried locally, whether it be the plethora of options that Jo's presented us with this afternoon or any other strategies locally, at that point where you don't feel that's gained the traction that you need to stop that behaviour, it's absolutely that point where I would recommend and suggest reaching out to the appropriate parts of the organisation that can do something more formally.
Thanks, Nick. I've got a question from Emily, and she's asking any advice for dealing with bad behaviour towards a colleague which is not witnessed by others. And I think, Jo, this might be where you start with speaking with good judgment.
Yeah, I'd get curious to go to the colleague first, because what you might be think is happening, what you think you're observing may not be what they're feeling. So it's actually good to get your facts correct. And we say to go into with that curiosity, hey, just curious how you're feeling about this today, and getting that information. As a peer, if it's a peer, I would encourage them to make the next escalation, and say, look, you've got a pathway you can go to, you've got, you know, depending on what your local pathway is. The other thing that may be needed, depending, and it might be something that you put out there, is support through EAP. There may be something actually happening outside of work that's impacting this colleague in the workplace. But I think it's really important to be a little bit objective and going and curious. And then if you hear something, to actually encourage them to escalate. If you actually do see observable behaviour, and you feel like your colleague is not in a position to be able to escalate that themselves, it's your choice on the pathway you'd like to take. But it might be that you have a conversation with somebody who's a mentor, or somebody who's a team leader within your area, that you could have a confidential conversation with and say, look, this is what I've just observed and this is what I think.
Thank you. One question that Leslie, who is part of our consumer committee, has raised is, do consumer representatives as partners in research who may actually be engaged in the development of research projects have a safe space to go to for help as well when they're engaged in the organisation usually as volunteers? Nick, did you want to make a comment on that, or Ali?
Obviously, this becomes a complex scenario because an organisation has responsibilities to its employees, but when it comes to external people, it can become a little bit more difficult. But we also have a positive duty to anybody who's interacting at our workplace. And so while it would require a lot of HR support to navigate this situation carefully, there would absolutely be an expectation that anyone engaging with our work is met with a safe and respectful workplace, and needs to be dealt with.
Yeah. Kim?
I was also going to say consumers as partners in research would also be able to, if they felt that they weren't being treated well, or there were aspects of the research that weren't being engaged with properly, consumers could also approach our human ethics committees and have a discussion with them about that situation, because that's definitely something that would come under that umbrella, their umbrella.
Definitely. So we also have a comment that says, it's commonly known that when bullies can't control you, they try and control what other people think about you. How can you combat the extensive rumours or nasty gossip they spread? Would anyone like to answer that?
I'll have a crack at this, because this is a really difficult one. But again, this is where a positive duty and a way of bystander training can perhaps have benefit here, because then you've got a workforce who's actually not prepared to hear negative discussions, and it's around that above the line and below the line piece, and people being able to say, I respect that you can have your opinion about a particular person, but at the workplace, I really want to focus on above the line conversations that are constructive, and I'm not really interested in hearing those sorts of things. So promoting that culture where people are really focused on keeping those basic assumptions front of mind, I think can help reduce that, and that if you demonstrate that in your own actions, then it'll encourage others around you to do the same.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really important point. And I think it is actually relying on the fact that, a lot of people can pull other people up for negative comments and gossiping. And that is an important way of, stopping people in their tracks. The other question was, how do you address promoting in experienced colleague in a leadership group and give them promotion when deserving candidates have been devalued and underappreciated for their contribution? So if you feel that, I guess that's about feeling devalued and unappreciated for their contribution. And that's another conversation I think that we're speaking with good judgment comes in, so that you open up that conversation with your leader. And Jo, please.
Thanks for that. So I've had an experience where I felt that, you know, I went for a position and I was really perplexed, let's just say, about why I wasn't given the position. And I sort of went that below the line going, oh, you know, what haven't I got that this person's got, and started to do that comparison. And this is some time ago, of course, before with good judgment. But now my thinking, my number one sort of tip would be have a conversation with the person who's the manager. Sit down with them and say, okay, if I needed to go for this position again in 2 years' time, what do I need to do skill set to get top of scope that I was obviously not, I may have been missing. Yeah. And I'd really want to work towards that and make it a positive thing. Make it a positive thing about getting better at being better. The decision's been made. So that's you have to work with that person. That's another challenge. You know, that's something from that emotional regulation piece that you'll have to sort of respond to. But use it as a flip it and go to that growth mindset and say, what could I do to actually improve so that if I went for this in 2 years' time, I'm ready for that area of gap that was missing.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the time it's about being able to have those conversations and feeling capable of having those conversations. And it might take a little while or some support to actually have the confidence to start that conversation, but not have the conversation. I think even if you need someone to support you to do it, or you need to practice it before you even ask the question or have that conversation, I think it's an important thing to do. Ali.
So again, this is a scenario where you can be a sponsor for somebody, that you can actually be their advocate for them and ensure that they are getting recognised. You know, in a meeting, if they've made a point that's somehow getting ignored, that they were the one that made that point originally, bring the attention back to, yes, when such and such brought that up at the start of this meeting, that was, you know, this has been a great contribution, and look where we've got with this. So there are little passive ways that you can make sure people aren't able to devalue that person's contributions. Vicky, there was also a question I think you missed earlier about the time to resolution, and that how this is sometimes discouraging, and that's why people don't speak up.
Yeah.
I think if I may, just that.
Yeah.
If people raise these issues much earlier in the process, resolution can be achieved quite quickly. Often what happens is it's not brought to attention until they've become really complex, challenging issues. And so the person's been existing in that really negative culture for a long time, and then it does take a long time to resolve, because it usually is now at a point where the implications are very serious. And so this has to be done very carefully, because it can be leading to somebody losing their job, having very damaging reputation. If things are brought to our attention quite early, we can support resolution very quickly. And we've actually had some really positive outcomes. I was meeting with one of my group leaders today who had a group culture that wasn't working very well. It was brought to our attention early. We supported that manager with coaching, and now that team is you know, knocking it out of the ballpark, has got great culture going on. So these things can sometimes really lead to great outcomes if they're addressed early and proactively and constructively.
Thanks, Ali. That's brilliant. Nick.
I was just going to add to Ali's brilliant points there, and in terms of sort of some lessons that particularly sort of human resource professionals and the like have learned over the years, is to ensure that there's a continuing communication loop while these processes are undertaken, because ultimately there's probably sort of two steps to addressing some of these things. There's that immediate sort of removing of the situation or de-escalating any immediate risk. But as Ali's touched on, sometimes there's extensive processes that need to be undertaken supplementary to that. And they can be protracted and long processes for a variety of reasons, whether that's sort of evidence gathering, procedural fairness, natural justice, and of the like. But in terms of maintaining that communication loop, in terms of people who are involved, here are the steps we're up to, here's where we're up to, how are you feeling, what supports do you need, do we need to pivot or do anything different? Sometimes these processes do take a long time, and that is unavoidable for a variety of reasons, but it's about how do we provide that support and as much as we can transparency and communication throughout the course of that process. And I think that's something that a lot of sort of functions in terms of the space of work I work in is really putting that focus on that continuous loop of feedback and ensuring that there is a degree of openness where possible in terms of stages we're up to, and ensuring that those supports are provided and expanded upon when required as we go, not just through those processes, but also after the fact in terms of when those processes have reached their resolution.
Thanks, Nick. That's really helpful. So we will finish up our webinar today at this point. There are a couple of links in the chat, one to the webinar and one for some of the Respect at Work link that Nick mentioned. I'd like to thank everyone for participating today, and I'd also like to thank our team for helping out and bringing your wisdom to this webinar. Thank you so much, and thank you to Linda and Amy for supporting us to get this out there. And anyone who is interested in more information, please fill out the survey and let us know if you would like a deeper dive on any of the things that we've discussed. Thanks, everyone, and bye.